It was the mid-80s, a few years after I had moved to the United States. I was giving a performance at the University of California Irvine, and the Tamil Padam was one of the pieces I presented. At the end of the performance, I was approached by a gentleman who asked, "Was that Brindama?" I was taken aback because, first of all, he was not of Indian origin. Secondly, he referred to her as Brindama, so obviously he knew her and the system of music well. It was actually my aunt, Sundaram Ramachandran, a prime disciple of Brindama. That's began my friendship with Dr. Garfias, who has been a mentor and supported me through this journey of dance in Southern California in the last 3+ decades. Welcome, Dr. Garfias. I know it's customary in America to call everybody by their first name, but having grown up in India, it is really hard for me to refer to somebody who's so much senior to me in knowledge and wisdom and age by their first name. So if you don't mind, I'm going to refer to you as Dr. Garfias. Welcome again, and thank you so much for being a part of this series, which will be a retrospective of Indian dance in Southern California.
Thank you.
A kind of oral history.
I just want to say, Ramya, I don't mind a little respect. Thank you very much. It's okay. Go ahead.
I'm happy to give you more. So I just recalled my first encounter with you at UCI, and I was wondering if you remember that occasion and what you remember of it.
Well, of course, my reaction to that was based on, it wasn't the first time I had seen Indian dance or heard South Indian music. And so out of that context, I came and I said, wow, I was prepared to see, okay, there's another young woman in Southern California who's doing Bharatanatyam. Well, I've seen quite a few. But I was quite impressed right from the start. But of course, hearing that voice, that was another thing. I'm so familiar with the interpretation of the Padams and Javalis by Bala and Brinda and the recordings of Vega, also Brindama and Vega when they were singing together. So that had that in my bones. So I heard that and it was like, wow, what is this? This is a connection. But quite apart from that, I was really impressed with the thorough grounding in tradition that I saw in the dance.
I have traveled extensively in Mexico, and I know, like India, the arts, traditional arts particularly, are embedded in the everyday life of the people. You migrated, or your parents migrated from Mexico, right?
My mother was from Mexico City. She came as a very young girl and eventually got to the point where she almost spoke no Spanish at all, and then she relearned it again when she married my father. So my father came later in the 1920s from Tehuantepec in southern part of the state of Oaxaca, very tropical coastal region by the coast, the Pacific coast. And he spoke mostly Spanish. His education was all in Spanish. So the long and short of it is that I grew up in a household where we spoke only Spanish at home, not much English really until public school.
So were they artistically inclined or were they practicing artists?
No, not at all. Neither one of them. My father was very artistic. He played a little music, he wrote poetry, he had beautiful calligraphy, absolutely gorgeous calligraphy. And he worked with an airbrush and did some design. He was a cabinet maker. He made fine furniture. But an artist, but he had to work at manual labor because it was impossible. The situation for Mexicans was very difficult. Well, it still is, but even then it was very difficult. So he had to work at manual labor. He couldn't work at his craft ever.
I know you were born in San Francisco and raised in the Bay Area, and San Francisco is much more culturally inclined than Southern California. But what kind of music were you exposed to as a child? Because there was no Spotify or YouTube or iTunes in those days.
That's right. That's right. It was very difficult. Actually, we knew very little of what was going on in the world. See, World War II, my education was mostly after World War II, during and after World War II. But travel became easier after World War II. And then at the same time, we started hearing true recordings. I grew up in San Francisco, and I think perhaps the first thing I started with was listening to Chinese opera. On the radio, I heard it. And I was quite shocked by the sound of it, but I decided to pursue it and try to figure it out and read books about it. And then whenever I could hear about some kind of foreign music concerts, I would go to Chinese music or Japanese music or whatever there was. But there was very little still in those days. It wasn't until much later. And I sort of got interested in world music before the discipline of ethnomusicology really developed. So when I went to graduate school at UCLA, by then they had formally started a program, and I was one of the first graduates in ethnomusicology to go there and study.
I was interested to know what triggered your interest in pursuing a career in music. In the Indian diaspora, even today, a career in the arts is not looked upon very favorably because either it's not lucrative enough or it's very competitive and unpredictable. So I was wondering how your family or your community allowed you to pursue a career in those days, several decades ago.
No, I think it was a fluke. I think I was encouraged in whatever I wanted to do. I remember we went on a visit to Mexico when I was 12 years old. And when we came back, my mother decided that I should learn the guitar. And she found in San Francisco, in those days, very rare, she found a classical guitar teacher who actually taught the old Spanish classical guitar. And there was no John Williams, or nobody knew anything about that. It was very, very rare. So that was an interesting thing. And then as I got to school, and since my father had a saxophone, I took it to school and played that in the band, and then I started composing and all that. So I was into music somehow or other already by junior high school. That's what I was focusing on. But how I got into ethnomusicology, I think one of the things that might have triggered it off was that in 1951, the year I graduated from high school, that summer I got a job playing on one of the ocean liners. And in those days, it wasn't the Love Boat or it wasn't this big cruise ships. It was the way most people traveled back and forth across the Pacific. And for the first class passengers on these big liners, they had a band that played for dances at night. So I got a job on the band, and I went to Japan and to Hong Kong and the Philippines. And I was quite impressed by what I saw of Japan. Primarily, I was impressed by the design, the inside of a Japanese house. I had never seen anything like that. So that was then I got really interested in it. This is before entering college and getting into graduate school. That came long after. So the interest started there. It's all kind of a fluke, though. It's hard to explain.
You kind of answered my question, but I know that you've done extensive work and research in Japanese music, and in fact have received the Order of the Rising Sun from the Emperor of Japan. So my question was, why Okinawan music?
Well, Japanese court music is what I really specialized in. The music of the imperial palace is played in the court for the emperor. And that's one of the really oldest continuous traditions in the world. I mean, that we actually know father to son going back at least 1,000 years, maybe longer. We can document who taught who and who. And the notation, although the performance is different, the notation is the same. So that was an accident. And by the way, I should add that when I received the medal from the emperor, I was expecting he would say, for your service to Japan and the arts. No, he said, for your service to humanity. So it was much bigger. So I was very proud. That was very nice. How I got into it, at that time in the 50s, when I entered graduate school in ethnomusicology, I wanted to do everything. I wanted to go to Africa. I wanted to go to India. I had met Harishankar and Ali Akbar Khan. And of course, there were no people who here in the United States who knew anything about Indian music. So we became friends immediately. They loved us because we were interested in the music and asked all these questions, and we'd go to dinner and talk. So I knew about Indian music, and I'd heard really gorgeous recordings. Not much South Indian music. It was then still mostly North Indian music. So I wanted to go everywhere, Africa, Latin America. And my professor said, well, you did a little work on Japanese music while you were in San Francisco. Maybe you want to pursue that. And I said, fine. And so he encouraged me to work on Japanese court music, and that's how that happened. But I certainly became fascinated and, in a small way, knowledgeable about Japan. There's a lot to know.
So is that court music played only in the court, not elsewhere?
It's not played. It's played at certain shrines and temples. For example, it's played New Year's Day on the first broadcast of the radio. It's broadcast now on television. It would be broadcast Japanese court music as a kind of ceremonial beginning of the new year. Most people in Japan know it, but very few people listen to it. It's very interesting that many Western composers, Messiaen and Hovhannes and Stravinsky, was very interested in Japanese court music. It's called gagaku. It means elegant music. It's a very interesting orchestral tradition. But the interest by Japanese is not popular like kabuki or the no theater even.
Yeah. And then you did go on to research and study other forms of music, like from Turkey and South Korea as well?
Well, I did filming and recording in South Korea and in the Philippines. I got a grant from the JDR Third Fund, which was John D. Rockefeller III's private fund when he was alive, mostly for Asian culture and arts. And at that time, it was during the Cold War, and they really were supporting both the Philippines and the Republic of the Philippines and the Republic of Korea. So they asked me to do a documentation to set up national archives for the Philippines and for Korea. So that's what I did back in the 60s. And now, amazingly, just last year, the Koreans recognized that. They invited me back to Korea, and they had a one-day conference with specialists from all over. They analyzed all my films and talked about the recordings and asked a lot of questions. And they published 4 books about my work. And one of them is a long history of my life, which is amazing because I've worked in many countries. Yes, I did field work in Romania. I worked with Romanian gypsies, and then I worked on Turkish Ottoman classical music. I did several field trips to various places in Latin America, all over Mexico and Central America. I did work in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and in Burma. I was the first American to be allowed to enter Burma. I spent a year in Burma studying Burmese classical music. And then most recently, I started studying Okinawan music. So because I already speak Japanese, I thought, oh, good. I've always been interested in Okinawa, so I went there. Yes.
So this is the reason I wanted to talk to you, Dr. Garfias.
Well, it doesn't make sense, does it? So it's good you asked me.
I've known you for so many years, but I had not known about all the work that you've done, over your lifetime. So this is really fascinating for me. You know that I grew up in Mylapore, which is kind of the heart
Yes,
of
I know.
Madras,
Yeah.
which is now called Chennai. And Mylapore is kind of a bubble for Carnatic music and Bharatanatyam. And my extended family was very closely connected to the Dhanamal family, of who the descendants of whom were Balama, Brindama, Muktama, and Vishwa and Ranga. And
Yes, and
my
now,
aunt,
we don't talk about Jaimal anymore. I knew Jaimal too,
yeah,
Balama's
yeah.
mother, who was a great singer, but we don't hear much about her anymore.
Yeah, so all of them, and as you know, that my aunt was the prime disciple of Brindama, and one of
Yes.
my cousins had her Arangetram under the guidance of Balama. And I have
Really?
seen both of them perform and heard them sing as well at many events, formal and informal events at my family, on different occasions in my family. So when I came here, as you said, when I came here and I first met you, I was kind of taken aback that anybody in America even knew about this special style of music. And then, of course, I worked extensively with Rusty Gillette, who was a
Oh, yes.
disciple of Ranga. And
Yeah.
also, Dr. Brown introduced me to the Center of World Music, and I have been performing there twice a year for the last almost 3 decades. So
In San Diego.
meeting, in San
Yes.
Diego. So
Yes.
meeting all of you was like quite, a pleasant surprise for me. And you had, as you mentioned, you had kind of front row seat to the introduction of this kind of music and dance to America. And this was in the 50s, right, in Wesleyan?
Actually, in the 60s. I
60s.
think, 1958, I met Vishwa. He was on a Fulbright studying at UCLA. At that time, I was in Japan, but I came back, and for a week we met, and we really bonded. Because, when I found out he was coming to UCLA, I had a grant to go to Japan to work on Japanese court music. I wanted to stay and study with Vishwa. And I can't. I have this grant, and so my path is laid out, so I went to Japan. But we met for a week, and we really bonded. And then in 1960, I was invited back to Japan for a conference, 61. And then Bala and her whole troupe came. So that was the first time I saw Bala in India. Well, being a friend of Vishwa's, Bala accepted me as a friend of the family. And that's when I got to know all of them. We hung out together in Japan, and I took them everywhere because I spoke Japanese, of course. But later I went to India. I think my first trip to India was in 1964. And Bala introduced me to her great friend, Amir Khan, who is the famous Khel singer from North India. And, many people have said, Nazir Jarazboy said, Amir Khan said, and she was also friends of Abdul Karim Khan, who had been dead for some time by then, that amongst the South Indian musicians, Bala and her family were people who also appreciated really good North Indian music. So through Bala, I met Amir Khan, and we went to a concert, and I sat next to Bala, and Amir Khan dedicated his whole concert to her, looking at her constantly, everything he sang, every time he sang something. So it was how shall I say it? Knowing Bala and her family was also an introduction to all these other musicians, Ali Akbar Khan, Ravishankar, who I had met before, but now in the context of Bala, she was sort of an opening to it. And it's very interesting. So I had a kind of an insider-outsider view. So when I heard your concert, your dance recital, I saw something. I said, this is not the usual kind of light imitation of Bharatanatyam, or I don't know what to call those things, but I felt this was close to the core. and I recognized it immediately. And certainly the singing of somebody who sounded just like Brindama sealed it for me completely.
As I mentioned before, that you had the front row seats to the introduction of South Indian music and Bharatanatyam at Wesleyan, and Wesleyan is probably even today the only university offering studies in Carnatic music, right?
I think so. Yes, yes.
So
I was never resident there, but I went there often to visit Ranga and Vishwa, and I had other friends, of course, the whole ethnomusicology program. Bob Brown, he started a program at Wesleyan, and I started a program at the University of Washington, and we were sort of parallel. So I knew about what was going on there, but I never spent a long period of time studying there. I was around it, went to many concerts there.
So Ranga also was at Cal Arts teaching right here in
Yes.
LA.
Yes.
So you were at the University of Washington as the dean of the School of Ethnomusicology.
Well, no, I was just the head of ethnomusicology. I what 15 of the 20 years. The last 5 years I was in university administration. I was a vice provost. But I continue to be involved in the ethnomusicology program, and we had many visiting artists. Bala came, and Lakshmi, and Vishwa, and Ranga. They came a number of times. So, yeah, I was involved, but I was up there while they were down. While Vishwa and Ranga were down here at Cal Arts. We'd come down to see them. We were connected. So, Vishwa started back in 1958 teaching me a Varnam in Hamzat Bandi, and every time we met, we'd do a little bit more and a little bit more. And finally, I spent a summer with him they were all teaching at Mills College as part of the ASEA program, and he gave me a room there to stay close to them, and so we played every day. But it's impossible. Long distance, it didn't work. I never finished the Varnam, so unfortunately, because basically I'm a flute player, so I was very attracted to. Yeah,
I've heard you play the flute. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what was the response from the audiences? Mainstream audiences. There must have been only mainstream at that time. There wasn't a large diaspora, Indian diaspora in the early 60s. So what was the response from the audiences? Because this must have been very unique and new to them.
Of Indian music, you mean?
Yeah, particularly South Indian music.
Yeah, it's funny because gradually there started to be these insiders. All these crazy American kids wanted to learn South Indian music. I think a lot of it was the charisma of Vishwa and Ranga. All those people who studied drumming with Ranga, so many all over the place. And so they all, so at the concerts, I remember this, the ones who knew something about Indian music would be keeping tala during the concerts. And then people would say, stop that, don't do that. Because the Americans didn't realize, you really need to keep up with the mathematics to figure out what's going on.
And it's
so there was that
ritual.
kind of, yeah, but for a lot of Americans, the music sounded beautiful. You see, Indian music is like you go and you look at that or you hear that and you say, wow, they really know what they're doing. I don't know what they're doing. I can't understand it, but obviously they're doing something very complicated. And then people start to study it, and then they get into the technicality. They begin to enjoy it even more deeply. But even for an outsider, you can't deny this is very impressive and very expressive music. I was remembering this morning, thinking about talking to you today, that you created a piece, and I thought this young woman is really quite amazing. You picked out. What was it? It was in Bilash Kani Todi, something of Ali Akbar Khan's playing a song.
Yeah,
and of all the pieces, the Tarana, right? Out of all the pieces on that CD, that's the one that attracted me most. And then you did this beautiful piece. I said, we must have been on the same wavelength or something like that. But how, for example, I know enough, I've learned enough about Indian music and hearing great musicians to appreciate what happens in that a particular raga to understand that it's kind of morose and sorrowful, but it's kind of hopeful at the same time. It's a very unusual emotion, and I've heard Bilash Kanitodi, Ali Akbar Khan playing a long 30-minute alap and chor and jala.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yes.
So from experience, I've learned to appreciate it a little bit. Nothing like what an Indian musician who's really trained does, but enough to appreciate it. So I appreciate Ramya very much.
And sometimes it's not
enough to know.
Sometimes you don't need to know the music, you just need to feel the music and experience it. And,
yes, but but it's also very possible to hear Bilash Kanitodi and not feel a thing because you don't know it. You have to get into it in a certain degree. I mean, yes, to us, to you and I, it seems perfectly natural. But to a lot of people, you have to get to a certain stage before you appreciate what's the difference between Todi and Bilash Kanitodi. Big difference.
Yeah. The Dhanamal family, they are probably the royal family of traditional hereditary music. They call it hereditary musicians who've for generations practiced and performed. There is even today a conversation and a controversy about how many of these artists have been marginalized and their arts have been appropriated. In your conversations and in meetings with the family, what was their feeling, or what did they feel about that at that time? Because that controversy is continuing, or I should say has been reignited in recent years.
Has it? Has it? Really? Well, the whole time I knew them, there was always some comment about Bala wouldn't dwell on it, but she would remark about people who had insulted her and mistreated her and said, these people and some people said, we can't let her go overseas. She's terrible. They want to send somebody who was beautiful, small, and smiling, and something. But nevertheless, some people knew enough to appreciate her. So there was always a conflict. There were those people who really knew and appreciated her, and she was buffered by those. But I think they were aware of the fact. I mean, even Mishra from time to time would get quite frustrated with the music academy in Madras. I still call it Madras, sorry, I'm old-fashioned. Yeah, they had their share of it, but I think they transcended it. They certainly had a lot of admirers who were not of that particular genre, generation, or something. So they were aware of it, very much aware of it. I think they transcended it.
So, talking about Music Academy, you did present a paper there, right? Was it in the 70s?
I think two or three times I did, 2 or 3. Dr. Raghavan.
Yes.
Who was such an open kind of person. He was interested in everything. He was open and welcoming, and so he would let me. I once gave a talk on Burmese music because he said, "Oh, you've been to Burma? Let's talk about it. Please come." But after he left, then there seemed to be no interest anymore. It was much more narrow, I guess.
So
I don't know. Does it go on now? I don't know.
Yes, it goes on very much. In fact, the festival in Chennai today starts in October and doesn't end till February. So it's kind of a long. I mean, it's really overdose of everything now in Chennai. It's kind of it's good because it's so vibrant with the arts, but also it's overwhelming and sometimes a little too much to absorb in such as within that time. There's literally thousands of concerts. I mean, living in Southern California, you can't even wrap your brain around that because we have hardly any arts here. But yeah, that's so. In a way, I'm proud to be from a city that is so rich culturally and artistically, but at the same time, it is also a little too much at times. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's no denying it's happening all over the world. Sometimes I talk about the fact that those old recordings, those 78 RPM recordings that were made before World War II, all over the world. Those are some of the best performances. The best performances of Japanese court music for me, in terms of performance, are still those pre-war 78s. Technology improves, but I don't think the performance necessarily, for me, I mean, I love the old tumris of Abdul Karim Khan. The new tumri singers, the technology of the recording is better. I don't get quite as excited, or I don't feel the depth. But in a sense, it's all over the world. I use this term all the time. As a matter of fact, the last paper I wrote very recently was on the demise of the Gurukulu system. Well, I'm not talking only about India. I'm using this term to mean the way everybody was taught in the old days. The teacher to pupil, one-on-one. That's the way people mastered tradition. And now more and more it's becoming conservatories. I suppose less in India, but everywhere else. In Japan, in Korea, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Turkey even. It's all done mass, a large group. One teacher in a large group. I think it changes. Even in Iran, they're saying the young students are learning the technology. They know what's called the radif, the body of tradition, but they don't know how to improvise. They don't know the spirit of the music, so they can't increase it. So something has changed. Maybe it's a sad note of modernity, new technology, I don't know. But it's happening everywhere in the world, all over.
Yeah, I know. But I guess that's what you would call evolution,
Yes, progress.
Progress. But I think as you get older, one looks back with nostalgia at the good old times when we would spend hours. And I always tell my students, it's not just the hour I spent learning, but the many hours I spent afterwards just observing her teach others. And I learned as much from observation as I did from learning. And most students don't have the time to just, linger and just observe. And also nowadays, even in India, there is no learning from osmosis because everything has changed. You don't listen to, I grew up, my neighbor's house, first thing in the morning at 5 o'clock, Carnatic music would start blaring. And whether you wanted to hear it or not, you didn't have a choice. You heard it and you kind of, by default and, absorbed through osmosis, but it doesn't happen anymore. Everybody's quiet in their little nests,
Vishwanathan told me that when he started to study with Swaminatha Pillai, he went to his house and he was kind of servant. He would sweep and clean and he didn't play for two years, I think, before he played. But by then he had absorbed the whole tradition. The Japanese court musicians, they would teach their sons the singing of the instrumental part. There's a vocalization you do of the instrumental part. And they would have to sing that every morning as the father laid in bed. The son would sing that. And only after he had sung the entire repertoire and memorized it, then they would begin to play. So they was absorbing a lot before they even began to touch it. But there's other things that happened. Well, I remember in 1959, the Japanese court musicians were invited by the UN, by Dag Hammarskjöld, to come and give a performance in the UN. And on the basis of that invitation, then they arranged a tour of the United States. Well, I was a student in the Palace at that time, in the Palace Music Department. So they invited me to go with them. What a wonderful experience. I toured the United States with these court musicians. And I was playing this one funny little thing. I played the shiriki, which is the small double reed instrument. It's very small, and it has 7 finger holes and just holes, nothing. There's no keys or anything. When you hear the court musicians play, when they go between one note and another, they make a little click. It's almost like a mechanical, you hear a little click. And there's no way I could do it. I just blew and the note was one note after another. After I had toured with them for 2 months across the United States and I heard them play every day, I was starting to make that little click. I could make it too, and I don't know what I was doing. I don't know how it happened, but I had absorbed the sound so much that now I could reproduce it. So some things you just learn by by osmosis, by being there all the time and listening. I was just remembering when I was at the University of Washington in the 60s, of course they expected me to teach gagaku, so I did. We got all the instruments, and that went on for many, many years until I finally got onto other things and got too busy to do it. The regular routine of teaching. I had to teach every single player on every different instrument. And I found that one of the things that I was trying to instill was respect, and I had to think about it. It's not respect for me. No, it's respect for the tradition.
For the art.
So you don't just be silly and clown. No, when you're doing this, you do it this way. You do it formally and, maintain your dignity. It was a hard thing to get across. And I began to think, am I trying to force them to respect me as a teacher? And no, that wasn't it at all. I was trying to get them to understand that this is a serious tradition. It's over 1,000 years old. So you have to treat it with a certain respect. When you enter into this, you have to have a certain attitude.
Actually, when I started teaching, I was pretty young, and I wouldn't like we would bow, on the floor. We'd fall on the floor and bow to our teachers before we start and at the end of the class. And I didn't ask my students to do that because I was, embarrassed and not comfortable. And when my teacher came and she asked me, why aren't they doing that? And I explained to her, and she said, no, it's not about you. It's about respect to the art. So take yourself out of it, and they have to do it. Otherwise, they won't learn the art properly, and they need to respect the art. So, there are certain rituals in traditional cultures which are meaningful, and I think in America sometimes we drop them.
We drop them.
And
just call me Joe. That's right. But no. The Japanese have the Koreans do too. They have a national award for the arts. And when we created the National Heritage Award at NEA, I remember I very specifically kept encouraging to follow that model. It's called, in Japan, it's called Mukei Bunkazai. This the intangible cultural property. It means like you're honoring something that has no body. It's not the person. It's the tradition in that person. It's what that person brings, the spirit that represents many generations past. So you're honoring the tradition, not the performer, of course, the artist who's doing it, but recognizing the tradition that it comes from. And that's very hard for Americans to get across sometimes. We had a lot of difficulty with that at time to time at NEA, but that was the spirit of it anyhow. In Korea, they have it too, the same idea.
So, Dr. Garfias, you served on the National Council, right, for the arts?
Yes.
And what was the mission of the council?
Well, the purpose of the council is to advise the president on all of the grants that come through from the National Endowment on the arts. So we went through, after all the panels that served, we would review all of these and mostly simply pass them on, but sometimes there were budgetary problems or we had to make choices. And we also advise the president on the national medals of the art. That's the big prize that the president gives to for artists, great artists in the country. So we would recommend to the president on those. And it was very busy. During the 10 years I served, we would have at least 4 meetings a year that lasted 3 or 4 days. But sometimes I was going back to Washington once a month. And this was all in addition to teaching. And in terms of teaching, it didn't count at all. It was just called public service. But it was a big deal. And getting to meet the president was always a nice thing.
Yeah, and you served from, you said Reagan to Bush?
From Ronald Reagan, right. He appointed me, and I would say it was his great mistake because I was not the typical Reagan Republican, but it was in his second year, so he was a little bit looser about accepting people. So
And
And
then
then
all,
with Bush the father, and then finally Clinton.
and I think it was in 1991 that I went with you to the NEA
Oh, yeah.
when we had the meeting about classical arts, right?
Yes, right.
Wow, that's
That was
almost 30
that
years
was
ago.
the subtitle of the folk arts program.
Yeah.
I think. I
Wow.
can't remember exactly. I was doing a lot of those going
Yeah,
back and forth.
Dr.
Yeah.
Robert Browning was there, and
Yes, right,
there were
right.
so many other artists from.
Rick Chamilios, I think, was there too from Hawaii.
Yes. I met him last year in Hawaii
Oh,
after so many
oh,
years. Yes.
yes. Oh, good.
And so I wanted to ask you also, since you've studied so many different forms of music, what do you think is similar in all the forms with, say, Carnatic music? And what is very distinct, in your opinion, about South Indian music?
Well, the odd thing is, and it sounds terrible to say this, but what I found is that every musical culture is distinct, has its own aesthetics, has its own values, things that are good. Tuning is very different. Intonation is very different from place to place, and the whole concept of intonation is very different in different cultures. Couldn't find anything that was universal from one place to another. Now, of course, we can talk about great parallels between North Indian music and South Indian music and on into the Middle East and Central Asia. Those are generically connected, and so you can find certain commonalities, but a lot of differences. The only really common thread I have found everywhere is a sense of spontaneity in the performance. The performance has to be alive. Even that you're playing from music, it's got to sound like you're playing it from the heart or from inside of you, from the spirit, not read from music or not recorded and played over again. That is a common feature I found everywhere. Every performance wants to sound spontaneous. The fascinating thing about South Indian Carnatic music is that it is unique. I mean, you can see certain threads with North Indian music, but you have to take a deep breath and start to really hear South Indian music and make that a world. And because it's just separate and distinct, the aesthetic of South is very different from the North, even though there are many, many connections. I think it's unique, yeah.
Yeah, I particularly like music which has, maybe because I'm a dancer and with the deep interest in abhinayam, for me music
Yes.
with bhavam, or what you said now is from the heart, is very important, and that's the kind of music that I enjoy rather than technical music, which becomes too much about
Right.
the math. I mean, that's all interesting and for a bit. And after that, I just don't want to be caught up with the technique or the math of it, but more the soul of the music, and how much of
But
the...
yes, that's true. But you have to have done the other. You have to have that before you can do. You can't do entirely only Abhinaya. People used to say about Bala, because I would travel and people say, "Oh, you're from India." I know all about Bala. Yes, and she only does Abhinayas. That's all she does. That's not true. I mean, and I've seen the Nrita that she does, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's very powerful. Yes, of course, the Abhinaya that she does, the Padams and Javalis, there's nothing like it. It's very, very special. That doesn't mean she doesn't do the other, and that is the grounding. So there's a balance. I mean, I think you do need to have that foundation.
What I mean is, I'm not saying Rita is not important, but I'm saying that even in music, I want music which is soulful and not just
Yes.
technique, and a lot of times, particularly today, with everybody's attention span being so limited,
Yes.
that artists tend to go for, like, grab you by the first 2 minutes, and keep you excited and kind of raise the
Yes.
intention being to raise your blood pressure, not to calm you down,
Well,
So,
I don't know where it's all going. I don't. You probably don't follow jazz, but there was a very important jazz recording. It came out in 1960 with Miles Davis, called Kind of Blue, and people have said this is everybody. It's probably one of the most well-sold jazz records of all, and magical combination of the six musicians there, five or six. A couple of years ago, there was a group in New York. The name of the group is called Somebody Else Does the Killing. That's the name of the group, if you can imagine that. Anyhow, they took this record, note for note, and played it again. The solos, the improvised solos, they played them note for note like the original. And it's uncanny. It disturbed me very much because we have the original, and at that time it was spontaneous. Now they have gone back and recreated this spontaneous, what was a spontaneous performance, and have frozen it. But it's so perfect. I can't deny that it sounds good, but I'm very disturbed that it's just this. Is this what we do now? We reconstruct old performances. We've run out of new things to do. It's a very interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I do listen to jazz. We love jazz, Harish and I. And in more recent years, we're listening to more jazz because our son is training to be a musician, and he was in New York and playing jazz and listening to a lot of jazz in New York, of course.
Really?
So
Really?
And he's home now thanks to COVID. So we do end up listening to a lot of jazz by default because music is playing 24 hours a day in our house.
Yes.
So
well, it's interesting. I said this to Marcy. Maybe it was about 5 or 6 years ago. I finally got a good saxophone, and she said, "What is this?" I said, I'm an ethnomusicologist. I'm known as an ethnomusicologist, specialist in Japanese music and some other thing. But in my soul, I still think of myself as a jazz musician. That's what I did for years and years. That sort of defined my personality. And so I'm still listening to a lot of jazz. It's very much a part of me.
So we look forward to your saxophone concert.
Yeah, no, you won't. It doesn't sound as good as it used to. I was practicing the other day, and I try to practice when she's not home, and she comes home and says, "Gee, that sounded pretty good." And I said, "Well, it doesn't sound as good as it used to, or maybe I was never really as good as I thought I was. But anyway, it's not where it used to be."
But it's truly inspiring, Dr. Garfias, because the story goes that my great-grandfather, when he was, this was in the 50s, he fell sick and he was bedridden, and he started learning Greek at 80. And so I keep telling myself I still have time to maybe learn Spanish, and that's one of Harish and my goal is to be able to speak Spanish, if not fluently, at least enough.
Please, Ramya. Please remember, 80 is not old. It used to be, but 80, ought to be 80 again.
So anything else you'd like to share with us, Dr. Garfias? And also wanted you to briefly share your thoughts on, you've been here now for 30 years almost, right, in Irvine? Right,
yes.
And
a little more than 30 years, yeah.
And your impressions and your thoughts on Indian dance and music, your observations in Southern California.
I'm so impressed by what you have done, and really impressed by all these young women that you have taught who you've had such an influence on their lives. So maybe they don't bow down the way they're supposed to. I think it wouldn't be a bad thing to have them learn to do that again, because it's respect for the tradition that you represent. But nevertheless, it's clear that you have done something incredible to all these young women. It's not just the tradition of teaching them what's not just what you have taught them, but it's something more about life that they've learned. And as I said once before, I've known a number of them who've come and studied with me at the University of California Irvine, and I've talked to them, and they're very much. Some of them won't go to university that they've been invited to because they want to stay and finish their Arangetram. I was very impressed by that, and so I've only met a few, but several, and they're all strong professional young women who've gone off and done other things with their lives. But this is the basis, and it's a very powerful, strong basis. I'm also impressed that not all the young women who come and study with you are South Indians. They're not Carnatic they're not from South India. There's a lot of North Indians, and so they see the Carnatic tradition as a solid cultural classic tradition from which to learn. Discipline. Wonderful. I think it's absolutely wonderful. It's a real gem, and I'm glad it continues. Thanks to you.
Thank you. And you also come to see many of our productions, and I do truly appreciate your support and your help, and your friendship.
I have been completely knocked out by how you put together a performance and involve all of them, the beginners and the advanced students, and they all get to perform at their level. But it blends. It's not just a what do you call it, a talent show for the end of the year. No, everybody plays a part that fits into the whole, and it's a great imagination and strongly based on tradition. Bravo, bravo, bravo. Bravo.
And Dr. Garfias, it's particularly meaningful coming from you because you've, as I said before, and as you've shared with us over this hour, all the the observations and the exposure that you've had to great artists like Balama and Brindama and Vishwa and all of them. They are the very essence of South Indian music and dance, and so having been exposed to them, to be even considered anywhere close to them, for me is a big honor. So like I said before, I was really pleasantly surprised, and I'm really thankful and grateful to you for being a part of this journey that I've had in Southern California.
Well, you have certainly, for me, made living in Southern California, in Orange County, a lot more pleasant and interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.